Hello and welcome to another video interview, which is part of the series ECMI Conversation with Experts. Each episode, we invite a prominent expert in the field of minority studies to discuss a specific topic with one of the ECMI researchers. Today, it is me having Ruairidh Tarvet as a guest. I am Martin Klatt. I'm a senior researcher at ECMI and head of cluster of the newly established research cluster Danish-German minority issues. We have Ruairidh here, who is a teaching research fellow at the University of Edinburgh. And we will talk about minority identity challenges in the case that is often considered a best practice example of minority inclusion, accommodation, peace process, reconciliation, and so on, the Danish-German border region of Schleswig. As I said, Ruairidh is a research and teaching fellow in Scandinavian studies at Edinburgh University, but I think if I remember correctly, your first contact with the Danish-German border region came some 10 years ago when you were teaching at Ruairidh Højskole. And
That's right.
Ruairidh Højskole is this Danish folk high schools, which are basically schools that started, came out of the 19th century movement of democratization, very often religiously affiliated too with Grundtvig, one of the leading Danish theologians. And Ruairidh Højskole is very special too because it is very visible on the Flensburg Fjord, like on the border to Germany, like a Danish outpost in the very south. And it has been some very prominent Danish politicians and other figures have been there as teachers or even leading this Folkehøjskole. Then in 2018, you did your PhD, and this is kind of when I guess you used some of your work from Ruairidh, our experiences there too, which focused on language and identity in Schleswig, and the interplay of regional, national, and transnational identities in minority communities. It has been published as a monograph, Reimagining Schleswig, where you have a very, when I first saw it, a very unusual way of pronouncing, or spelling the region, Sleswig, which is a mixture of the Danish Slis and the German Wig. You are currently working with another project funded by the LLC Research Fund, Borders as Living Spaces, Debordering and Re-Bordering Identities in Europe. Perhaps you could shortly introduce this new project you're working on, and then we will go down to the interview.
Yeah, well, thanks very much for the kind introduction. This new project looking at borders as living spaces is part of a wider movement in border studies with many other researchers across Europe, including yourself, engaging with this topic, looking at the transnational living dimensions of borders, border regions, and not just seeing borders as this often termed scars of history. They're not just the point where a nation ends and another one begins. They are indeed far more complex and nuanced than that. And what I'm looking at in this project is a comparative look at various different regions across Europe, primarily taking the Danish-German border region as a case of supposed best practice and seeing whether or not, comparatively, it actually is a case of best practice, looking in comparison with other regions. What's interesting about this project is it allows us to take some of the identity questions, some of the history, and compare that with what's happened in other border regions, such as, for example, even the Austrian-Slovak border region, which is seeing the rise of a new minority, which hasn't historically had any basis. So it's quite interesting to take this question of the Danish-German border region and expand that beyond there and cast a light upon some of the other border regions in Europe.
Yeah, thank you. And this is leading us into this question, Schleswig best practice. There is a political narrative, and it has been repeated over and over again, that this is just so great. Why research in Schleswig? Why did you pick this topic for your PhD? What is so interesting to look at?
Yes, as you mentioned, I did work in the Danish-German border region, and indeed, when I was an undergraduate, I studied German and Danish for various different reasons. But my own background is partially from the area. My great-grandmother was from Flensburg, and I'm a dual German-British citizen as well. So I have a sort of personal connection to it as well. But looking at what happened in that region, and even my own great-grandmother as well, she was thrown out of her family as a Dane for marrying a German citizen. This was back in the 19th century, late 19th century. And I always wondered what could have been so contentious back then as to throw a family member out of the family because they simply married someone with a different national identity. And that got me looking at this question of what is national identity? What is this process of nationalization? And how can we balance some of the objective dimensions of national identity with the subjective side, which is also very important, the feelings that come with this, the emotions, and that deep sense of personal rooted identity. And indeed, this narrative, the two narratives really that dominate the region are either reconciliation, coming past conflict, moving on from years of national conflict, versus a more Danish narrative of reunification, this idea that in 1920, when the border plebiscites were held and democracy determined more or less the outcome of where the border should lie, that part of Schleswig, northern Schleswig, was reunited with Denmark. But this doesn't really seem to make sense still. If we're looking at this region as a best practice model, why do we have these two narratives? Why do we have these two competing ideas of what happened and how things have been resolved? And I think recent political decisions, recent international crises have really shown that there are quite a few holes in this best practice model. And I think this could be a really interesting area for study over the next few years.
And what would you say are the holes? What is it that we don't know?
Well,
where can you challenge the best practice narrative?
I think we have to come back to this question of identity and what it actually means. And one thing I always say to my students, and they really don't like this very much at all, is you don't own your identity. It's not something that you own. Identity is a negotiation. It is between you as the subject, how you feel, how you perceive yourself to be, how you view the world, and how you see your place in it, versus, or as well as, how the world views you to be, how the world perceives you. And we can look at this in terms of either a subjective and an objective dimension, but there are other ways of conceptualizing it as well. But essentially, identity is this negotiation. It's not something that you own. It's not something that the world determines necessarily for you. It exists in this ever-changing space in the middle of constant change, constant negotiation. And there will always be different factors swaying it in favor of one side or the other. And I think this is one of the problems that we have when considering the Danish-German border question, and that is that identity is not a solid, concrete issue. To simply speak the Danish language or the German language cannot in itself be a sole indicator of one's national feelings or how one identifies oneself to be. For example, I myself, I speak Danish and I speak German, and I've lived in the region and I've participated very actively in the matters of institutions, but I don't consider myself to be a Dane, for example, even though I could quite objectively play upon that card if I wanted to. There are some problems with belonging as well. Danes in the Danish minority, when they travel to Copenhagen, suddenly realize they don't feel as much at home as they do when they're in this border region. And similarly, Germans from the German minority, when they travel to Berlin, also realize, oh, I don't really feel fully accepted as part of the national majority. And so there's this complex problem with identity being, in this case, somewhat regionally a phenomenon as well. But
I think, if I remember correctly, in your thesis, you had this result, and that actually, when you ask a Danish minority person whom they feel closest to, and having the like Danes in Denmark, Germans, or the German minority in Denmark, the result was that most of them felt actually closest to the German minority in Denmark, vice versa.
Yes. And this is one thing which minority institution leaders don't really like to point out for multiple reasons. And that is that because these minorities are vastly bilingual, they speak both German and Danish for the most part. They engage in a similar lifestyle in a similar territory, which is a cross-border region, Schleswig. They engage in similar minority practices, have shared problems and experiences. So they do, in fact, have quite a lot in common with each other. One of the reasons they might not want to point this out is because these minorities are, of course, funded by, in part, by nation states. And there's this whole question of legitimacy around identity. And that's something else I wanted to come on to as well, because I said that identity is not something you own and it's not something that's owned by others, but there's still a sense of a stamp of approval coming from the state or other authorities when it comes to legitimacy of identity. Now, for example, I've brought here, this is my British passport, the new one, which does not say European Union on top. And one might think, looking at this, okay, well, perhaps we're not European anymore. And yet, with the German one here, we see European Union and the country as well. But passports in themselves are problematic because when it comes to identity, you might have a passport that doesn't reflect your identity. I must admit, I don't feel necessarily very German all the time, maybe in certain contexts. But if I'm in Germany, I certainly feel like an outsider. That's absolutely certain. But recently, the Danish government decided to give a fast track to Danish citizenship for members of the Danish minority. And this was controversial because it's something that many people have asked for, to have a stamp of legitimacy saying, yes, look, I can show you I'm Danish because my passport says it. You can hold it up as a symbol of national identity. But on the other hand, it creates two classes of citizens, those who meet the criteria for getting one and those who don't. And I think when you've tried to talk about the region as this best practice model where reconciliation and peace has been achieved, why would you want to throw a grenade right into the middle of this debate and say, well, here we, the state, declare that some of the minorities are more legitimate than others? I think that's hugely problematic.
And it, of course, also raises a lot of other issues too. I mean, you know that Hungary, who kind of modeled that policy quite a few years ago, is criticized heavily for doing this, and it also raises an issue about the understanding of national minority as being, I mean, the core idea of a national minority is that they're citizens of the state they live in, and this is in the conventions and so on. So in fact, you could, I mean, with your German passport, if you resided here, you could decide to become a member of the Danish minority, but if you move to southern Denmark, you could actually not really become a part of the German minority because you're not a Danish citizen.
Yes, exactly.
A German citizen. And this is, of course, creating a lot of confusion. On what it is to be national minority, what is the difference between a national minority and other ethnic minorities, which are migration-based. How does national minority protection fit in with multiculturalism and so on?
I think it's again a shift away from the subjective side of self-declaration, self-identification, which in itself is not problem-free either, but one could argue it's the path of least conflict. towards the state deciding what constitutes a member of an identity group. And this can be hugely difficult when we take the war in Ukraine, for example, as a case where one of the reasons stated was for the protection of a so-called Russian minority, regardless of whether these individuals felt Russian or Ukrainian. The Russian state was saying they are Russian, and therefore they gave their one of the reasons for the illegal invasion. So it sends a huge question and ripples across Europe. If the state can determine who is a member of its nation, who is not, and national minorities don't have a voice in the matter, they don't have a say in the matter, then is this becoming a more authoritative trend in the democracy of minorities?
And I mean, of course, it's also tied to these that we have in almost every European country, with perhaps the exception of France. We have a very ethnic understanding of nationhood, or like a titular nation, that this is the nation, it's their state. And if there are some minorities, it is granted that they are there, but they are minorities. And I see a big danger in that, when we give citizenship to, like when king states give citizenship to the minorities, then suddenly they're not. This idea that minorities should be respected within the state they live as a full equal citizen as everybody else is kind of weakened. Mm-hmm. And I think I fear, especially when we are aware of that the population around often is not really quite clear or aware of what a national minority is. And we know that from here, from Denmark, Germany, that there are quite a few people who believe that just the other day I was interviewed by a Frisian who lives in Berlin, and he was very surprised when I told him, well, no, the Danish minority, it's the German citizens who live here and feel Danish or are part of the Danish minority.
And I fear that oh, sorry, on you go.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to suggest that if we continue along this trend where the state or state authorities have too much of a voice in determining identity, the people themselves start to believe this. The people themselves start to think, well, it's not up to me to have a voice in this negotiation. Actually, it is up to some higher authority to determine not only my statehood, but my nationality as well. And the two shouldn't really be confused. And I think this has become even more highlighted in the recent years with international crises, looking back to the so-called migration crisis of 2015 through COVID, and again, the war in Ukraine. The more that state actors, national executives, parliament, for example, they take decisions that affect the lives of national minorities, for example, by closing borders, that this changes perhaps perceptions of what a minority is, and minorities themselves might start to question, well, perhaps I am just part of the state's definition of the national picture.
I mean, we had, of course, a very extreme situation in 2020, 2021, but this is the research we have done that demonstrates this did affect people's identity change. I would like to go back a little bit to this identity and this feeling close to, like, having a kind of a joint minority identity. This has been taken up here, and I have also discussed it with a few people. The German minority who has long been in Denmark, who has long been kind of what they call zweistimmig, like identifying in both identities, or accepting a more complicated multiple identity, complex identity situation. When I mentioned that at their annual convention in January, they were, of course, very much, well, no, we do not want to become a Schleswigian identity. We still feel that we are a German identity. It was, unfortunately, the young people had left. It was more or less the 40 plus or even 50 plus German minority generation that was still present when we had this discussion. I also had a discussion with the chairman of the Danish minority in South Schleswig, and she said, well, this might be an individual that, of course, they're not that clear-cut, but she said that we as an institution, as an institutional minority, we have a responsibility to maintain Danishness.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is kind of our raison d'être. This idea of recreating a Schleswigian concept of identity, which is among others also voiced by Sten Fransen, University of Southern Denmark, is not really by key minority stakeholders, is not really seen as a way to solve this dilemma of that minorities constantly have to kind of justify their identity and are challenged in their identity, and that their own identity or what they themselves feel, as you said, it might not reflect of what they are perceived.
Mm-hmm. This is a hugely politicized matter, and one of the problems with institutions, minority institutions, seeing themselves as, for example, the Danish minority institutions as flag bearers for Danishness, is that they themselves have to then define what is Danishness, how do we view it, and one can risk becoming over stereotypical in Danishness. Is it simply waving lots of Danish flags around, eating Danish food and singing Danish songs? And then it becomes almost more Danish than the everyday life of some Danes on the other side of the border. This is not what the research shows the case to be. In almost every study I've conducted and seen in the last 5-6 years, people, especially in the younger generations, do see a sense of duality of identity. They do see a sense of commonality with their counterparts. They do see even aspects of hybridity to some extent in their identity. Most certainly, it's not the case that they're just displaced nationals in a host state. That's far from the reality. But I think the institutions are worried themselves, because if they suddenly recognize that they are not, well, if they see themselves to be diluting their sense of Danish identity or German identity for the German minority, that they risk losing support or funding from their state counterparts and perhaps support from members if they're seen to be diluting. Whereas this is not the question.
And may I interrupt? We're getting close to we're using too much time. And I think the point you mentioned there with his kin state support and the kind of a perception of what the kin state wants them to be does play a role, even though Danish politicians very frequently say, no, this is not about you define yourself, who you are, and so on. But of course, there is also this, as long as you, I think it was Poul Nyrup Rasmussen, the Prime Minister of the 1990s, who said, like, we twisted the 1920 promise, we will not forget you, into as long as you stick to us, we will not forget you.
Mm-hmm.
And so indicating that, of course, there is an expectation that this is not just a language school, but that there is a commitment by the people to Denmark in one way or the other who are in the Danish minority. And then, of course, we have to keep in mind this, and this is a result of the best practice of the lack of tensions between Denmark and Germany in general, that many or even a majority of the students in the Danish minority school system come from families that did not have a previous connection to the minority before they started sending their kids to a Danish kindergarten. And that also on the other side of the border, I just heard yesterday, I visited the Frisians in Ostfriesland. And I heard the story that now a majority of the children from the island of Amrum, it's a small place, some 3,000 inhabitants or 2,000, where the children cannot go to high school. They can only go to school until 10th grade. And then before, they used to go to the high school on the neighbor island of Før, where there is a Frisian branch in Gymnasium. But now that the majority of them they go to Deutsches Gymnasium Nordschleswig. So they finish high school in Denmark proper at the German minority high school, and that this high school even has a Frisian quota now. And so we have some very peculiar cross-minority networks or movements.
And this is natural,
yeah.
isn't it? It's natural that minorities, by definition, are a small community, and in order to have their voice heard and to fight for similar cross causes, they need to kind of network and band together. But again, the risk of this, if the Frisians, the Danish minority, the German minority, all were to band together under one sort of border region minority community, it would dilute some of the cultural aspects and linguistic aspects that separate them. And indeed, one would then question, is this a construction process? Is this artificial? So it comes with a whole host of problems, again, with legitimacy.
So all in all, would you say we have to rethink the concept of minority on the basis of your research and our discussion here?
I think the concept of minority should be shifted. The debate needs to be shifted away from seeking top-down legitimacy from state authorities or from even minority institutions themselves, and should be seen more of a bottom-up process where the minorities themselves are listened to. And that's one reason why doing this kind of research is so important, because by doing these interview studies, survey studies, we're giving voices to members of the minority to determine how they themselves feel on the subjective side of the debate. And oftentimes that clashes with and goes against the narrative coming from the top. So I think we definitely need to keep providing a forum for especially young people and the minorities who will be determining the future direction of politics in these communities to express themselves and to have a role in determining the future.
Yes, wonderful. And to sum up with your new research project, where do you think this kind of will give us new knowledge? What will be the key results as when you can, or what do you hope will be the key results when your research will have finished in a couple of years?
Well, I do think what I hope probably doesn't match with reality. I'm mixed between pessimism and optimism in terms of outcomes. One of the key trends I'm looking at right now is whether or not the recent crises from the so-called migration crisis through COVID, through the war in Ukraine, has shifted the focus away from minorities and towards affiliation with the nation state. And there's already some signs that this is starting to be a trend, especially with regard to, for example, anti-immigrant rhetoric in Danish mainstream politics and Danish parties with anti-migrant policies. This is sparking quite a counter-reaction in the Danish minority in Germany, because they feel this is a part of Danishness they can't get on board with. They don't feel necessarily the same, I don't want to go as far as saying hostility, but they don't feel the same emotional anti-immigrant stance as some do north of the border. And indeed, southern Denmark has seen traditionally, especially in the last 10 years, quite a strong voter share for right-wing parties that have an anti-immigrant stance. And this goes against this kind of Willkommenskultur that the German state promoted since 2015, 2016 even, of refugees being welcome. So already we're seeing how the nation state narratives and political trends are driving a wedge, because if the Danish minority can't see an aspect of their Danishness reflected in what's going on north of the border, that drives a wedge between their connection with this so-called authenticity, you know? And that's why we need to be aware that these differences are perfectly fine and they can exist. And that shows that they're not just displaced nationals. They do have their own unique dimensions. And these are thoughts that are shared between the two minority communities.
I mean, it shows very much how they reflect being borderland. I mean, I have a past in border studies myself, and and probably a future too, because when we go into this, minority issues are very, very often tied to borders and bordering processes. and so on. So I would like to thank you, Ruairidh, for being here. I'd like to thank the viewers for using their time. I hope this was an interesting seminar for you. I can announce that that from 1st of April, there will be an exciting new project on border studies, borders shaping perception of European societies, which ECMI will be associated in through my person. Because I will be the coordinator of it, and it has a working package that is also looking on minorities' perceptions of borders in cooperation with the European Academy in Bolzano, EURAC, which many of the viewers might know. So we will, I'm sure we will have plenty of opportunities to further dig into this connection between borders and minorities. And I'm very optimistic, Ruairidh, that there will be cooperation with you and with your research too. So thanks a lot for being here.
Thank you very much for having me.